Child stars are a unique blend of raw talent, the perfect role, and a lot of tricks used by the professionals.
I like being called just like an actress. This only stars from the sky.
For instance, little Danny from The Shining had no clue he was even in a horror movie. Stanley Kubrick worked his magic to get what he needed from him that perfectly fit the bigger picture. And when you think of child stars, there are some iconic ones from each decade. Whether it's the 80s and Gary Coleman asking us what we're talking about,
What you talking about, Willis?
or the 70s and Tatum O'Neal learning the con artist ropes.
But I give you a $20 bill.
You give me a $5.
No, ma'am, it was a $20 bill.
Or even Macaulay Culkin booby-trapping Christmas.
You guys give up, or you're thirsty for more?
Whatever your first instinct was, it probably wasn't the 1950s. But there really were some fantastic, talented child stars who lit it up even back then. I'm Nostalgic Nick with Do You Remember? And today we're seeing what the biggest child stars of the 50s did in the 60s and 70s. Be sure to hit that thumbs up icon for us, and subscribe to the channel for more throwbacks. But come on, let's dive back in time. Richard Keith. When Richard Keith strolled into his audition for I Love Lucy as a precocious 5-year-old, Lucy took one look at him and said, "Okay, he's cute, but what does he do?" At which point the young tyke walked over to a nearby drum set and proceeded to lay down a beat that blew everyone out of the water. And landed him the iconic role of Little Ricky, instantly making him into one of the biggest child stars of the 1950s. Richard continued to act throughout the 60s, with a recurring role as Opie's best friend on The Andy Griffith Show. However, after high school, Little Ricky pivoted back to his first love, drumming. And he's had a long career in the rock band David and the Giants. These days, he's still keeping the beat, and since 1990 has been the executive director of his wife's ballet company, which has locations all around the world. Richard has also published an autobiography aptly entitled Life After Lucy in 1994. An eventful life, I'm sure. I might have to find a copy soon. Tommy Kirk. One of the biggest Disney stars of the 1950s, with unforgettable turns in The Swiss Family Robinson, and of course the rifle-wielding older brother in Old Yeller, who was forced to put down his, oh, no spoilers? Okay. The dog is fine. But multiple generations of children were scarred in the process. But the good times were not to last. And when Disney found out that Kirk was gay in 1963, the studio unceremoniously fired him. Oh, good old 1950s openness. And after being shoved off a cliff by Mickey and Company, his career took a steady decline. Like so many of his child star peers, Tommy Kirk turned to drugs to help him cope. And by 1970, he was heavily addicted to pills. But this story does have a happy ending, as Tommy eventually did get clean and ran a carpet cleaning business for over 20 years. Sadly though, Tommy Kirk recently passed away in September of 2021 in his Las Vegas home. Kirk was 79 years old. Angela Cartwright. This child star shot to fame in the late 50s as the adorable stepdaughter on the massively popular sitcom The Danny Thomas Show. She replaced the previous daughter of Kathy, played by Leilani Sorensen. And after Angela was adopted by Danny, the ratings began to pick back up, helping the show last another 7 seasons. And the advent of a new decade did little to slow her role, as Cartwright appeared as the middle child in the pioneering sci-fi TV show Lost in Space. And of course, as Brigitte Von Trapp in the little-known movie The Sound of Music. And we have 2 great deep dives if you want to revisit space or the hills that are alive with The Sound of Music. But the following decade, the 1970s, weren't quite as kind to the former child star. Case in point, she was in Beyond the Poseidon Adventure, universally agreed to be one of the worst movies of all time.
Don't you ever say that to me again!
But the slowing down of her acting responsibilities freed the still young artist to explore other ventures. And it turned out to be the catalyst that allowed Cartwright to embark on a very successful photography career. These days, Angela is 69 years old and runs her own photography studio in LA. No word yet on whether she's still terrified of thunderstorms, but we'll keep you posted. Catherine Beaumont. Now, Katherine was practically the voice of Disney animation in the 1950s. She was personally chosen by Walt Disney to take us all the way down the rabbit hole in 1951 as Alice in Wonderland before helping us soar to the stars as Wendy Darling in the magical 1953 Peter Pan. With all this success by the time she was only 15, you might think Beaumont would have continued to have a long-lasting career, but that was not to be. After graduating high school, she completed 2 live-action acting gigs in 1955, one being an episode of the TV series Climax. But she decided then to enroll at the University of Southern California, and eventually pursued not acting, but education. She decided that show business wasn't for her, and instead became a teacher for 36 years. She did do the occasional voiceover work reprising her role as Alice in the 90s and 2000s, but these days at 83 years old, she lives a happily retired life, hopefully with no smoking caterpillars to be seen. Ron Howard. Now, this child star got his start at a very young age. In the late 50s, he made several appearances on hit shows like The Twilight Zone and Dennis the Menace before catching his big break as Opie on the iconic Andy Griffith Show. As the lovable son of Mayberry's sheriff, little Ronnie captured the country's heart, portending a long and fruitful career. And then he just kinda fell off the map and was never heard from again. He never went on to star in one of the greatest sitcoms of the 70s, and certainly didn't become one of Hollywood's most accomplished and celebrated directors. No, last we saw of Ronnie, he was walking east on Route 66. Obviously, we're joking, as he's just mind-boggling talented. Mr. Howard is 67 years old, and still as active as ever. You can check out his latest directed picture, Hillbilly Elegy, starring Glenn Close and Amy Adams on Netflix.
And I'd say more than anything, I want to find stories that I think can transport audiences.
Bobby Driscoll. When Walt Disney sees enough in your young personality to make you one of the first 2 actors Disney Studios placed under contract, you know you're on the way to stardom. And indeed, Bobby Driscoll soon became one of the biggest child stars of the 50s. He appeared in Treasure Island and landed the iconic voice role of Peter Pan in that 1953 classic.
It's easy. All you have to do is to...
Driscoll was also one of only 13 children, along with such luminaries as Shirley Temple and Judy Garland, to win a Juvenile Academy Award. But there was soon trouble on the horizon. The roles began to dry up, and by age 17, Driscoll had turned to heroin in order to cope with the limelight failure. And after being sentenced to a Chino Rehabilitation Center, Driscoll was released in 1962, and when his parole was lifted in 64, he found that the acting opportunities were long gone. So he moved to New York City with the hopes of reviving his career on the Broadway stage. Instead, he became part of Andy Warhol's entourage at the notorious Factory. Still dependent on drugs and running out of money, Bobby Driscoll disappeared, and in 1968 his body was found in an abandoned East Village building. A very sad end for one of the 50s most precocious stars. Lauren Chapin. If the 50s needed a poster child for how being a child star can ruin your life, then Lauren Chapin would be it. Chapin burst onto the scene as the youngest daughter Kathy Kitten Anderson on the hit show Father Knows Best.
That means you too, Kitten.
I haven't said anything.
A role for which she won 5 Junior Emmys. But after the end of that super successful show, Lauren struggled to find work. She said, quote, "I couldn't get a job. I'd been typecast as Kathy Anderson. The more I didn't work, the more my mother drank and the more belligerent I became." Chapin soon turned to drugs, both using and selling, and an ill-advised marriage at only 16 would end just 2 years later. In addition to selling drugs, Chapin at various times also worked as a flight attendant, a dog groomer, and insurance claims examiner. These days, she's fortunately clean, an ordained minister, and performs in a live, interactive version of Father Knows Best for cruise lines and conventions. Not quite prime time, but we're certainly glad she's still afloat. George Winslow. The majority of child stars start on TV and then try to transition to the big screen. But George took the path less traveled, deciding to begin in the biggest movies in Hollywood right off the bat. Winslow's first roles were alongside Cary Grant in two 1952 films, Room for One More and Monkey Business. And the next year he was in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and delivered some iconic lines to Marilyn Monroe as she was stuck in a port window.
You've got a lot of animal magnetism.
Pretty suave for an 8-year-old, but acting just wasn't for George. And at the tender age of 12, he decided to quit showbiz altogether. He would go on to serve in the Navy during the Vietnam War and had a long career in the U.S. Postal Service before unfortunately passing away from a heart attack in 2015. George Winslow was 69 years old. And there they are, some of the biggest child stars of the 1950s. Do you remember watching all of these talented youngsters? Who was your personal favorite to watch? And what other talented child stars did we leave off the list? Please let us know in the comments below. We read them all. And if you don't mind, smash that thumbs up icon for us and subscribe to the channel for more. From all of us here at Do You Remember, thank you very much for watching.